have to remember is that human beings are mammals, and therefore we have the same instinctive responses to danger as any of the animals. We tend to use the cry for help response more than animals do. We have a little more sophisticated version of it. But otherwise, we rely on the same responses. And as we talked about this morning, the nervous system remembers all danger signals we've known before, so that what we see in kids, as well as parents, is our patterns of too much arousal for the situation or too little. Okay? So when we complain that somebody has no feelings, we're really talking about too little arousal. Yeah. The ability to put whatever you're experiencing into words is dependent on being in the window of tolerance. It isn't to say that we become completely nonverbal when we're in hyper or hypoarousal, but our language, our ability to perceive reality is going to be biased by either feeling too little or feeling too much. Right, so you might ask somebody with too little arousal, how do you feel? And that person might say nothing. And because that's all the words that you could muster in a state of low arousal. George Boyd was a 16-year-old who came to a workshop I gave for the state of Massachusetts called Trauma 101. 40 teenagers from residential programs across the state came for this workshop. And George Boyd came up to me and he gave me this acronym. He said, trauma. And the acronym for trauma is triggers, remembering all unneeded memories at once. Okay? That's the experience. So the result, if your nervous system is dysregulated, if you're sensitive to traumatic reminders, you end up on what I call the post-traumatic roller coaster. And I coined this expression because as a treater, you can end up on the roller coaster too, right? You're going up and down along with the client or the family or the child. So you get on the roller coaster when you're triggered by the old danger signals, the feelings become overwhelming, we become impulsive, the thinking brain shuts down. And what most people do is we blame the trigger. Right? It was that person. It was because he said, right? Because she did. And sometimes if you're a helper, the child or family is blaming you. Okay? That increases the fear, distrust, and sensitivity to triggering. And if the child or adult then acts out or shuts down, it brings temporary relief. So acting out is discharging too much arousal, right? Shutting down brings us into the I don't care, whatever zone. Then, of course, what happens for kids when they act out or they shut down is they're accused of being oppositional or they're accused of being resistant, which of course triggers more mistrust and more fear and more anger, which leads to more defiance, more oppositionality, quote unquote, right? And eventually, the only relief is to want to die or to give up caring about anybody or anything. Right, and that's often, I think that, today I'm hearing Ruth, I feel very inspired because obviously her mission on this planet is to put an end to this cycle, right? Where kids are left with despair or self-destruction. Now, to get off the roller coaster, we can actually start any place along the ride. But the easiest place to work is teaching kids and families how to recognize triggering. And a lot of the common triggers for kids are not what we would expect. So being ignored is a trigger, but being spoken to is a trigger, right? Because when you're a kid who's abused or neglected, the only time grown-ups talk to you is if they have something bad to say, right? They don't say, hey, let's sit down. Right? I want to know how you're feeling, right? I want to know how school's going for you, right? That's not how it works. Eye contact, being alone can be triggering, but being with other people can be triggering, right? Having to do something is a trigger. Not being able to do what you want is a trigger. So can you see how being told no or having to say yes are both triggers? This is every day, right? These are all day long kinds of triggers. And for kids, the signs of traumatic activation tend to look very behavioral, right? Kids who can't sit still, we can call them ADHD, but if somebody actually did a study, I bet most kids who are currently being diagnosed ADHD are children of trauma. But unfortunately, nobody's done that research to differentiate the what I call the pedigree ADHD, right? I come from a long line of versus the trauma related. Also, there are a whole bunch of hypoarousal symptoms that for kids often get labeled as no motivation. Right? And why people think that calling kids underachievers motivates them is really kind of a mystery. And I felt I could say that to this group, and you guys would that's really, that really spurs you on when somebody says you're underachieving. Okay? So all of these, when I train special education teachers in Massachusetts, the teachers have a hard time understanding, why do kids lose motivation when they're successful? Why is it that they don't seem to care? But all of this makes sense in the light of trauma. Also, school phobia, being afraid to be alone, an inability to disclose information to grown-ups. Now, doesn't that make sense as a symptom? But oftentimes kids are accused of being secretive because they don't trust grown-ups enough to confide in them. And then reenactment symptoms, which can include aggressiveness toward others. And I think a lot of parental violent behavior probably falls under that category. Dissociative symptoms. In the mental health world, there's what I call a phobia of dissociation. Nobody wants to talk about it, okay? And usually it's equated with dissociative disorders. Whereas dissociation actually is a word that describes a lot of different phenomena and goes hand in hand with trauma. But when kids look in a trance, when they seem spaced out, that's dissociation. When kid says, I don't know how that happened, or I don't know what happened, I don't know why I did that, that could be dissociation. Generally, it's assumed that the child is quote unquote lying, okay? Or that it's resistance. Rather than, maybe this child doesn't know because he or she dissociates. Okay? It's amazing to me when you see very clear signs in a child or an adult, right? This person acts very differently in the same situation at different times. Right? This week, she was very engageable, but last week, there was so much anger in the room, it felt like it could spontaneously combust. Now, the problem for all trauma survivors, adult or child, is this basic problem that words can describe, but they can't resolve the sensations and action patterns that come from the core imprint of the trauma. So for all of these years, the idea that if you just talk about what happened to you, it will resolve, is not backed up by the research. Just again to acknowledge the role of sensory motor psychotherapy, without which we wouldn't be here. Now, in sensory motor psychotherapy, one of the things that we do, which is very, very relevant for kids, but also for grown-ups, rather than asking people to talk about what happened, not that we avoid doing that, but that's not the primary emphasis. Instead, we look for patterns, habits of response that tell what I call it, the symptoms tell the story better than the story. Because if I look at patterns of response, like as soon as there is a positive energy between me and this child, right, he, she distances or acts out. Or I'm noticing a pattern that this individual starts to say something and then takes it back, and then starts to say something and falls silent, right? So that's a pattern that tells us a story. So we observe people right here, right now, and we look for how is this person's story being told through the body, and how can we use the body as a channel for intervention. It's very cool because it doesn't rely on the verbal ability of the person you're sitting with, right? It doesn't rely on insight, and we don't even need somebody to acknowledge they've been traumatized, right? Which really is helpful when, especially for kids, the issues of love and loyalty really complicate disclosure of abuse as well as memory. Now, I'm going to run you through a whole series of sensory motor techniques and interventions that help people, both child and adult, who can't use a lot of words or who may have all the words, but it doesn't change the patterns that they struggle with, that their loved ones struggle with. And the first set has to do with how do we help people use their thinking brain when, remember, traumatic activation shuts it down. And one of my favorite techniques, which I use all day long, is what I call the multiple choice question or menu question. As a parent, I wish I had had the menu question. It would have been a wonderful thing. So I want to ask a question. So I could ask a child, well, when you feel worried about something, what happens? Do you get tight all over, or do you get really jittery, or do you just freeze and can't say anything? And by the way, notice that I kind of act out the different choices because I want to communicate with my body. I do this with adults, but for kids, the body communication is so important. One of the things about anger is that its best use is as energy. And you know who the poster for that is Ruth, right? Ruth embodies, you take anger, and instead of discharging it, right, you use it to fuel courage, determination, right? Energize yourself, energize people, right? There she is, our poster. Somebody can pass that on to her. Right? So when I am working with somebody who's afraid of anger or has too much anger that just kind of gets discharged onto other people, I ask them to notice the anger as energy. Right? So notice that anger. Is it more like energy? Is it more like tension? Does it want to do something? Same with nothing. Don't you love it when kids or grown-ups say, you kind of do all this, I'm really concerned about your feelings. I'm wondering how you feel. I don't feel anything. Right? Shoots you right down, doesn't it? But I have the response. What does nothing feel like? I actually have a client who every week she comes in and I say, how's it been? And she says, fine. And I say, fine as in, I wouldn't tell you, even if it was my worst week ever. Fine as in fucked up, insecure, nervous, and emotional. Or fine as I had a great week. And then she laughs, right? And usually she says number one, right? I wouldn't tell you. For people who have less access to words, two choices, maybe multiple choice, is too many options. How about, does that feel good or better? Does that feel better or worse? I did a little experiment with a woman who is just enraged with her husband, who actually, he's Israeli. He comes from a very different culture. They're both traumatized people. No, she traumatized in the more usual physical and emotional abuse context. He, because in Israel, you live in traumatic conditions, it's not safe. And so after listening to her for 40 minutes talking about, and he's this, and I don't respect him for that. And at the end of that, I said, when you say those words, I don't respect him, and I'm not sure I even like him, how do you feel? Do you feel better or worse? At first she said, I feel better. I feel like I'm respecting myself. And I said, okay, well, do your feelings feel better or worse? And she said, worse. And then I said, what happens when you say, I suffered so much as a child, it's hard to still be suffering now. Do you feel better or worse? And she said, I feel better. Because all this time she thought that just, if I just get angry enough at him, I'll feel better. But actually what makes her feel better is being supportive to her. It was bad enough I grew up with an absent father and an alcoholic mother. And it's even harder to have a unhappy marriage. Another sensory motor concept, very consistent with nonviolent parenting, is the intervention of experiments, which actually comes from Gestalt. Rather than making suggestions or teaching skills, an experiment is trying out that skill or intervention, and simply out of curiosity, rather than with a goal in mind. which is very nice when you want a child to try something. And especially with teenagers, as soon as you have a goal, right? Would you try something, meaning I want you to do it, right? Immediately it's all over, right? So an experiment is, we can't agree on this. Would you be willing to experiment? Let's notice what happens if we try it your way. Let's notice what happens when we try it my way. Almost anything, from a therapeutic intervention to negotiating dinner time is made easier with experiments. Now, in a sensory motor way of working, there's a very nice, simple paradigm. And the paradigm is triggers are going to happen. It's unavoidable. Arousal is going to get dysregulated. It's unavoidable. And the question is, what are we going to do next, right? So anticipating triggering and dysregulation as just the way it is. Now, if I could go back and be a mother all over again, knowing what I know now, that one of the things that I would do is just relax into all the dysregulating. Right? It's just part of being a little kid and being a parent. Right? It's inevitable. And the important thing is, what do we do after the dysregulation? Do we get more dysregulated because it shouldn't be this way? Or do we relax into it and find ways to regulate ourselves? Right? And these are all examples of different experiments in self-regulation. By the way, psychoeducation is actually a great intervention for regulating the nervous system. Because if you can get somebody to focus on something, that's why I made the flip chart, because focusing on the visual image seems to change. I think it's because there's a concentration practice element. And what happens is that the amygdala slows down and the frontal lobes pop on. It's a lovely, lovely thing. And by the way, one of the things I forgot to mention this morning is that the flip chart is translated into Spanish, French, and German, and is about to be translated into Arabic. Can you believe it? Very, very exciting. Bruce Perry underscores this idea that we have to have verbal interventions that act on the body or nonverbal interventions because children raised in the vortex of violence have learned that nonverbal information is more important than you can trust nonverbal information more. So we're going to actually, let me see if I did, oh, it's good. So we're going to actually do some of these as a group. You know, in sensory motor psychotherapy, as a therapist, you're not allowed to use an intervention that you haven't tried out yourself first. So we don't believe, you know, and it was so obvious once I was trained in sensory motor. Why did we ever think it was okay to try out an intervention on someone else that we'd never tried on ourselves, right? Right? It actually, that seems a little violent, actually. So there are lots and lots of traumatic reactions in the body, but there are also lots and lots of ways we can use the body to regulate. And actually, one of my favorites is the sigh. And it's another one that's great for all ages because it's something that even little kids will do, right? So if I say to Nika, who's my 7-year-old granddaughter, if I say, okay, 1, 2, 3, right? If I do it a few times, she'll start imitating me, right? She'll start entraining that. So try out the sigh on yourselves. Not that we're terribly dysregulated. Doesn't that feel good? So I happen to love this because when I use it, I'm working with someone who's dysregulated, and that's dysregulating me, even if subtly as well. So as soon as I do it, I start to feel more regulated. Now, grounding is a bottom-up intervention that we're all familiar with, but there are probably 20 different grounding exercises. What I happen to like about the sensory motor grounding intervention is it's something that you can do with a minimum of effort from the other person, right? Because when somebody's overwhelmed, spacing out, or about to blow, to ask that person to, for example, look around the room and find 4 red objects, that's probably not going to go over very well. But the simplest kind of grounding, and you can try it out for yourself, is to just feel the ground under your feet. I always start there, because once in a while, you'll ask somebody to ground with their feet, and it will freak them out because they're going to feel like they can't run, right? It's probably 5%, but so first I ask people to feel the ground under their feet. And then notice what happens if you push your feet against the floor. If you put some pressure against the floor. And notice what your body does when you engage your leg muscles and press against the floor. Anybody feel a change in your, what do you notice?
Sort of lengthens.
Right.
Structure.
Yes. So your spine kind of automatically lengthens, which again, whether you're the therapist or the client, whether you're the caregiver or the givee, either way, it's good. And if we're grounding, I'm doing it with my client.
I noticed you shaking.
Was I shaking a little?
You were doing that.
Yeah, that could, yeah. And that's actually, especially with kids, grown-ups feel a little funny, kind of stomping their feet, but kids love it. So actually, the adding the foot stomp for a kid would be great. Now, movement. For kids who are impulsive, ironically, movement is a great intervention. And with kids, what I love to do, because if you think about hyperactivity, if I say, let's just do slow walking, right? If you're an ADHD kid, that's so mean. Isn't that mean? Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's walk as fast as we can, right? Okay, now, slow, medium, right? And then maybe I'll let the kid take a turn and tell me, should we do it fast next or should we do it slower? Okay? Because that starts to give the child a sense of having control over movement. And think about what's hyperactivity. It's not a pleasant state. It's not like kids love being restless and fidgety and jumping out of their skin. For little kids who feel disempowered, who feel sort of not big enough, another wonderful intervention is this, right? make yourself big enough to fill up the whole room, okay? Like make yourself as big as, right? Whatever, like Nika loves giraffes. I could say, make yourself as big and tall as a giraffe. And since she's very short, she would probably love that, right? Right? Does that feel good or bad? Do you want to make yourself bigger? Because that feeling of inner bigness means that we're going to have, when we have that feeling of inner bigness, we have the confidence that makes us feel safer. Does that make sense? Another of my favorites. And it's funny how a lot of these are a personal preference thing. I just happen to like this. This is sort of similar for, again, grown-ups or kids whose feelings are too big. And you ask the child, and again, you can practice this in anticipation. So I could say, the next time the boys on the playground tease you, and you start to have big feelings and you want to cry or yell at them, let's see what happens if you make a container big enough to hold all of those feelings. And try this out. I mean, again, it's also great for parents. If you have a parent who desperately needs a way of regulating big feelings so they don't get taken out on the child, just try it. See what happens physically when you make this movement. What changes in your body when you...
There's a spaciousness.
That's right. So your chest opens and there's a spaciousness. And can you feel like you have more access to your heart?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I could teach this to a mother in those critical moments where you actually need to have an open heart, but you want to kill your kid, right? I hope that's okay to say in echo, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just
So don't do it.
That's right.
Or you're feeling dysregulated along your children.
That's right, exactly. I remember when my older son was colicky, and I remember when he was probably, 4 months old. We lived in an antique house in Massachusetts, a 1740s house, with a sort of square stairwell that you could walk around because there were rooms off of it in all 4 directions. And I remember I'm walking him around the stairwell for hours, right, trying to soothe that colicky baby. And I remember on like past 120, I suddenly felt this impulse to just drop him off the stairwell. And I was so horrified in that moment. Oh my God, I didn't. And that's when I realized, apropos of what you just said, is that the difference between an abusive mother and a non-abusive mother or father is that in that moment you don't drop the child. Right? And that's really the difference. Is not that you don't feel it, it's that you don't, you do something different. I think one of the reasons why they fight us over the broccoli or the chocolate chip cookie before dinner and all these little battles that you can have as a parent is because of that feeling of disempowerment and no boundaries. Right? It's easier to tolerate waiting, disappointment, frustration when you feel empowered, right? I mean, not to say that it's easy, but when you feel empowered, it's a lot easier. So boundaries are really, really helpful for kids in a regular, safe family situation. They're crucial for kids who have trauma histories, and especially crucial if they are still in the families in which they've been traumatized, right? Even if the families are working on it, it's still a traumatic environment. So let's try out some of these, and then you'll get a better sense from your own body what it would be like to try them out. By the way, I also teach them to spouses because having a sense of boundary with your spouse or partner is, as Robert Frost said, good fences make good neighbors. So try this. Try it out. And just notice what happens in your body when you make this movement. Notice what muscles engage, how your posture changes. What do you notice?
I don't have to block or armor my body because the hands are doing it.
Right. So you don't have to block or put up a wall in your body because you've got this. Absolutely. What else did you guys notice?
More exhale.
A longer exhale? Uh-huh. And the other thing, I don't know if any of you noticed that I noticed, is that when I make this movement, there's a very subtle engagement of the boundary muscles. So we have boundary muscles down our sides and across the midriff. Right? Those are the boundary muscles. And the cool thing, as I'm thinking about what you just said, is that if my boundary muscles are engaged, my heart is still open, right? Because the boundary muscles start about here, right? So I have a boundary, but I also can have an open heart. I can have a soft face, right? I don't have to, I remember, sometimes with clients, but certainly I remember as a mother, having to have this stern face, so I thought I should. Ruth would, I'm sure, have a lot to say about that. So just feeling this sense of boundary. What I do with kids is I teach kids to feel the boundary muscles, and then they can feel them with the hands down. Okay? So that there is a sense of protection from their own body. Another wonderful thing, again, you can do it as a parent, you can do it as a therapist, you can do it as somebody working with the whole family, using pillows, cardboard blocks, or a 20-foot piece of string to make a boundary. And then all kinds of wonderful experiments can be used to build whatever resources the child or adult might need, right? So, for some kids, guard their boundaries, with a lot of energy. And so for them, making it playful, like rolling a ball back and forth across the boundary, can help them to both feel the boundary but also not feel like they have to defend it every moment. For kids who are don't have a sense of having a boundary, having the parent or therapist sort of intrude something across the boundary so that the kid can push it out. Okay? So all of these things build skills in the body. Okay? yes, this is actually a concrete example from an adult who actually came to me because he had read Pat Ogden's book, Trauma in the Body, and he was all excited about how he was going to make boundaries and he was going to push people away. And he could hardly wait for that to happen organically. He just wanted to do it right away. And so finally I sort of gave in. And he just started to he said, okay, I'm going to make a boundary. I got this far. And he froze and went into terror. Because what he didn't realize is his body associated boundary with danger. And he and I later came to understand he had a very scary, intrusive mother. Right? If he put up a boundary, he was dead meat.
Mm-hmm.
And his body remembered that. So even though he was all gung-ho, I'm going to do this, when he actually went to do it.
Meaning when there's been an unsafe or negative experience with having
Right.
attempted to support.
Exactly. Or it could be as simple as a kid who's been very badly punished for saying no. And the body remembers this as a no experience, even if I don't attach that language, right? The body's going to experience this as a no experience. Let me see if the one I like is on here. Unfortunately, we don't have a sound system, so I can't show you the video. The other boundary exercise that I really like, it may or may not be in the slides, is this one. So try this out without hitting each other if you can. Make a giant kind of bubble around yourself. Okay? Just like you're creating a kind of energetic bubble. And then notice what you feel like inside after you've made your bubble. So you notice any change in your internal experience? Yeah, what do you notice?
A little more calmer and protected.
Yeah.
Whereas actually for the other one for me, I could feel a little bit of primal, like that min and end of it.
That's right. And that's what people sometimes experience with this is, and then usually it's a somatic memory of, if I have this kind of boundary, I will be abandoned, punished, right? The connection will be severed. And this somehow feels much safer. Yeah. I mean, I noticed a feeling of spaciousness inside. Did anybody else have noticed that? Yeah, that expansion inside. So this is the one that I love to teach to kids because, and I call it the invisible bubble. So I say, this is your secret weapon. Nobody is going to know that you have your bubble. Right? You could call it a bubble of strength. You could, whatever language works for a particular individual that speaks to them. And if your mom and dad start fighting, just go in the bathroom and make your bubble. So you can feel okay inside your bubble no matter how much they are fighting. Yeah.
What if someone goes into the space of their bubble? Does that just destroy the concept?
If they what?
If somebody walks into the space of their bubble, does that destroy the safety of the concept?
Good question. And thank you for asking it, because the key I found with all of these is to really concentrate on the feeling inside rather than the space outside. Because you're absolutely right? that if the parent comes into the space, which is quite likely to happen, it's really important that it be about what they feel inside. That once they've set the bubble and they can feel the bubble feeling, they know, because really, isn't that what we want kids to feel? No matter what's going on outside you, there's a place inside you that is okay, that's safe, that's yours. And again, it takes many, many, many repetitions for adults to internalize that, much less kids. Right? Rhythm. One of the techniques that Bonnie Goldstein developed that's described in a chapter, and now of course cannot tell you the name of the book, but if you need the title, you can email me and I can get it for you. She talks about using drumming and the drumstick as a kind of talking stick to help kids verbalize their feelings, right? So just think about being a little kid having trouble putting words to your feelings, and you're encouraged to beat the drum and then let the drum talk. Okay? Very cool. Another wonderful technique, again, I think this is something that I would particularly teach parents who start to lose their orientation to the here and now. So one of the biggest problems, in parenting is, as parents, we get triggered. In that moment, the child feels like the enemy rather than the gift or the responsibility. And essentially we're lost in time. We're back there as little children rather than here as grown-up parents. And so one of the things that helps all mammals, including humans, get back into present time is just the simple turning. Think of dogs, right? Dogs do the orienting thing the best, right? So when you orient all around the room, and you notice, who's here and where am I, right? So I can see the gardens out the window, right? I can see all of you here. I can see where I am. And that automatically tells the body you're safe. Another thing that is really, really important is how we use our social engagement systems in speaking with kids about their experience. And actually, I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was doing a in-service at a residential program for kids 7 to 11. Can you imagine 7 to 11 in residential care? Very, very, very young kids. And I was setting up my equipment, and 2 little boys, probably around 9, wandered into the room. And they asked me what I was doing. I said, this is my classroom, and I'm going to be teaching your staff today. And then I had this inspiration. I said, hey guys, what do you think your staff needs to know? Okay? And they just turned around and walked away as if I hadn't said anything. Right? Just like, bye. Right? And I thought, very interesting. Then I realized, of course, traumatized kids. Why does a traumatized kid not like to answer a question?
Because if you get it wrong.
Right, exactly. Right? And so luckily they wandered back a few minutes later, and I tried again, taking a different approach. I said, hey guys, come on over here. I need your help, because I don't know your staff, I don't know what I should teach them. Right? Can you guys help me out? What do you think they need to know? And as soon as I asked for their help, I could kind of see the whole energy changing. They said, I think they need help with when we freak out. Which was it was so on point. It was perfect. Because of course, that's exactly what they need. Right? So, one of the things that is probably most important is how we deal with our own dysregulation. So to the extent that kids have hyperarousal symptoms, so do caregivers. So as we feel the onslaught of a child's dysregulated nervous system, we get dysregulated too, right? We can go into hypoarousal, and I think this is true with children and families, individuals, right? We start to feel hopeless and numb. We start to feel irritable and anxious. And so one of the most important things is regulating our own bodies. And one of the things that I realized that Ruth has done is in nonviolent parenting, you have other thoughts, right? There's a whole other repertoire of thoughts that you bring to the table rather than what I'll call the traditional paradigm thoughts, like he shouldn't get away with this, or this isn't right, or I have to be consistent, right? Or some of the things parents might say to themselves. But if I say, oh, she's really triggered, he's having a big old fight response today, my reactivity is going to be different, right? If I'm curious, my nervous system is going to regulate. And that's literally what I do with my clients. When I start to get dysregulated by my clients, I say to myself, be curious, right? What's happening in this moment is happening for a reason, right? Gotta be curious about it. The more we cultivate positive beliefs, not just regulate negative ones, the more our nervous systems will respond. Think of it as combating the negativity bias by cultivating positivity. I use humor. If I didn't laugh a lot every day, my nervous system would be a wreck. Right? Also, I believe that every piece of human behavior is adaptive. And that if it's not adaptive in this moment, it's there, it's in the body, it's in the repertoire, because it was adaptive in some other moment. And so that way, no matter how bizarre or self-destructive the behavior is, I can't help but be curious. Let me just, how are we doing, Alan? 1 minute, okay. So, a trauma-informed treatment prescription says we need to acknowledge the past, but focus on the present. The key to changing behavior is understanding triggers and patterns. A no-blame attitude. Talk about being in sync with nonviolent parenting. Speak the language of the body because it's a no-fault language. If I say, oh, I think your thinking brain took a little hike, and your feeling brain just took over. When your little sister wanted to wear your favorite dress. Positive rather than negative interventions, I'm speaking to the converted. So let me end with these are the mantras that keep me sane in an insane world. Jesse Jackson's words that remind me as caregiver, we're not responsible for being down, but we are responsible for getting up. As caregiver, we can feel so often that it's our responsibility to get people up. From Naranon, which is the family program associated with Narcotics Anonymous, your role as helper is to be things, not to do things. So often we start to feel like we have to do more rather than to be. And when all else fails, and I'm not sure what to be, I keep Deepak Chopra's words in mind: in the midst of movement and chaos, keep stillness inside of you. So I hope that this was useful, and it certainly was fun for me. So thank you all for coming. Any questions? I don't know. Do you guys have a break now, or are you moving right along? Anybody who has questions, I'm happy to answer. And those of you who need to get going,